Little black twins knock on elderly woman's door. What they confess shatters her world. Betty Thompson's gnarled hands paused midair. The garden shears she held trembling slightly as her gaze locked onto two little girls walking up her path. They were small, far too small to carry the weight of the worry etched into their young faces. Their matching curls bounced with each hesitant step. Their wide eyes darted nervously, as if every shadow held a secret. The 80-year-old widow froze, her breath catching in her chest. She watched in silence as the twins climbed her porch steps, their small fists clenching and unclenching at their sides. For a moment, the world seemed to slow. The hum of bees, the whisper of leaves, it all fell away as the two little girls stopped at the base of her door. One of them, her lips trembling, lifted her chin just enough to meet Betty's curious gaze. The words that followed were soft, nearly lost in the rustle of the wind, but they struck Betty like a blow. "Can you help us, miss? Our new daddy doesn't like us." Betty's world shifted beneath her feet. She dropped the shears, their metallic clang echoing through the silence. For a long moment, she could only stare. The twins stood close together, their hands clasped tightly, a barrier against the unseen darkness they seemed to carry with them. "Come here, darlings," Betty finally whispered, her voice hoarse. She sank down onto the porch steps, her arthritic knees groaning in protest, but she didn't care. "Sit with me. Tell me what's wrong." The girls hesitated, glancing nervously over their shoulders, as though someone might appear to drag them away. Finally, the bolder of the two, Betty thought she must be older by seconds, judging by her protective demeanor, stepped forward and lowered herself beside Betty. Her sister followed quickly, sinking into the space between them. "What's your names?" Betty asked gently, hoping to ease the fear she could practically see radiating off their tiny frames. "I'm Emily," the older one said softly, "and this is Sophia." "Well, Emily and Sophia, it's a pleasure to meet you," Betty said, forcing a small comforting smile as she reached to pat their little hands. "What makes you say something like that about your daddy?" Emily bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. "He yells at Mama, and he's real mean to us when she's not looking." Betty's stomach turned to lead. The depth of emotion in Emily's young voice was far too heavy for a child to carry. Betty turned her attention to Sophia, who had yet to say a word. The younger twin clung to her sister's arm, her head buried against her shoulder, her small body trembling. "Did something happen, girls?" Betty asked softly, her voice a tender whisper that carried more strength than her frail body might suggest. Emily glanced back at their house, her shoulders stiffening. "Last night," she began, her voice barely audible, "he got really mad. He said we were too loud and locked us in our room. Mama was crying. We heard her. She sniffled, rubbing at her damp cheeks with her tiny fists. I tried to get out to help her, but he said if we made any more noise, we'd be sorry." Betty closed her eyes briefly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest like a stone. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady, filled with both sorrow and resolve. "Where's your mama now, sweethearts?" Emily looked down at her shoes, her voice quivering. "In the house with him." Betty sat there in silence, torn between her desire to hold these little girls close and her growing sense of dread. She couldn't ignore what she'd just heard. It was in their words, the fear that clung to every syllable, and in their eyes, as though they had already seen far too much. "Do you want to come inside for a bit?" Betty asked gently, though her mind was already racing. "You must be hungry." Emily looked at her sister, then back at Betty, her little shoulders lifting in a hesitant nod. Betty led them inside her small, tidy house, the familiar scent of lavender and fresh baked bread greeting them like a warm embrace. She settled them at her kitchen table, slicing pieces of buttered toast and pouring glasses of milk. Neither of the girls spoke as they ate, but Betty didn't rush them. She watched instead, her heart aching at the quiet way Sophia picked at her bread, while Emily finished both slices without complaint. Betty sat across from them, hands clasped tightly around her teacup as her mind worked furiously. She thought of the strange encounter she'd had the day before when she tried to introduce herself to the family. The man, Tom, had barely concealed his hostility, and the woman, Melanie, had seemed defeated in a way that made Betty's heart ache. But it was the muffled sounds she'd heard the night before that came rushing back to her now. The heavy thud, the sharp cry, the silence that followed. She set her tea down with trembling hands. "Do you girls feel safe at home?" she asked softly. Already knowing the answer, Emily shook her head, her eyes fixed on her empty plate. Sophia, still silent, clung to her sister's arm. Betty knew what she had to do. "Girls," she said after a long moment, her voice gentle but firm, "I need to make a call to someone who can help your mama. Is that okay?" Emily looked up, her eyes searching Betty's face for something. Trust, reassurance, perhaps even hope. "Will they take us away from her?" she whispered. Betty leaned forward, her voice steady. "No, sweetheart, not if we can help it. But you and your mama need someone to stand up for you, don't you think?" Emily didn't respond, but she didn't object either. Betty stood, forcing herself to move with purpose as she crossed the room to the small rotary phone on the wall. Her hands shook slightly as she dialed. 911. "What's your emergency?" "This is Betty Thompson," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I'm calling because I'm very concerned about my neighbors. There are 2 little girls here with me, and I think something's terribly wrong at their house." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Betty explained everything she'd seen, everything the girls had told her. And when she hung up, she turned back to the table. Emily and Sophia sat close together, their small hands intertwined, and Betty felt an almost maternal protectiveness wash over her. "Everything's going to be all right," she said softly, though her heart was pounding. "I promise you." The minutes dragged on, like hours as they waited. Betty made the girls comfortable, offering them toys from an old trunk she kept in the living room and a few sugar cookies she'd baked the day before. The twins played quietly, their movements tentative, as though they were afraid of being too loud. Betty kept watch from her window, her chest tightening when she finally saw the distant flash of police lights. 2 cruisers rolled to a stop in front of the house next door. Betty's breath hitched as officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached Tom and Melanie's house. Betty glanced back at the twins, her heart aching as they huddled together on her couch. "It's okay, girls," she said, kneeling in front of them. "These people are here to help." Outside, the tension was palpable. Betty couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see Tom's body language. Angry, defensive, his hands gesturing wildly as he spoke. Melanie stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face pale and drawn. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers stepped forward, his voice rising above the others. Tom's resistance turned physical, and Betty watched, frozen, as he was restrained and handcuffed. She saw Melanie's expression crumble as she was led aside by a female officer, tears streaming down her face. At that moment, Emily and Sophia bolted toward the window. Betty's heart seized as they peered out, their little hands pressed against the glass. "Mama," Sophia whispered, the first word Betty had heard her say. Betty moved quickly, wrapping an arm around each of them. "Your mama's going to be all right," she said softly. "She's brave, just like you two." Moments later, there was a knock on Betty's door. A female officer stood there, her expression kind but firm. "Are you the one who called, ma'am?" "Yes," Betty said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The officer looked past her to the twins. "These are the girls?" Betty nodded, glancing back at Emily and Sophia. They clung to each other, their wide eyes darting between Betty and the officer. "Will they see their mama?" Emily asked quietly. The officer crouched down to their level, her voice soft. "Yes, sweethearts. Your mama's safe now, and she'll want to see you. But first, we're going to make sure you're safe too. All right?" Emily nodded slowly, and Sophia buried her face against her sister's shoulder. Betty watched as the officer gently led the twins outside. She stood in the doorway, her heart aching as she saw Melanie break free from the other officer to kneel on the grass, arms open wide. The twins ran to her, throwing themselves into her embrace, their cries carrying across the quiet street. Betty pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. For a long moment, she stood there, her shoulders shaking as she watched the family hold each other tightly. Then, as Melanie's eyes met hers, the younger woman mouthed a single word that carried more weight than anything else. "Thank you." Betty stepped back inside her house, her heart still pounding, but lighter than it had been in years. She sank into her favorite armchair, the house quiet once more, though it no longer felt empty. She thought of Emily and Sophia, of Melanie's tears, and she whispered into the silence, "You're safe now." And for the first time in years, Betty felt like she was too.